Alright, let's get back to your normally scheduled rant vlogs. I'm going to talk to y'all about the GOAT paradox, the greatest of all time paradox, because I've been following this channel Hip Hop DX a lot lately, where they do this video series called Greatest of All Time, where they'll take a rapper and make the argument for whether or not they could be considered the greatest rapper of all time. And they've had all these long conversations about the nature of the greatest rapper of all time, where the host, Justin Hunt, I think is his name, will go on this podcast, this guy called Rude Jude, or radio show rather, and they have had all these conversations about like what they think qualifies something as the greatest of all time. And this is kind of like it's an inevitable conversation that I feel like everyone loves having. Everyone wants to try to qualify, like, what are the greatest? What is the greatest? You know, I've seen so many greatest of all time lists of everything done in so many different ways. We keep trying to make them bigger and bigger and to ask more and more people to try to create these combinations of, like, personal opinion and sales and impact and, like, just to try to consolidate all the information possible to see what is the greatest of all time. You know, what have we all collectively decided is the greatest? And the conversation about what could be the greatest is interesting because a lot of people really like to credit originals. They like to credit influence. They like to credit time-testedness. You know, some people will say that the greatest of all time cannot be determined unless it's been like 10, 20 years since it came out. You know, it has to stand the test of time. It has to be considered the greatest of all time still 20 years later. Or, you know, it can't be the greatest of all time if only so many people appreciate it. If this or that. There's all these different little circumstances people like to put on it. But I feel like the conundrum about the greatest of all time is that we're trying to determine it in the moment. It's always something we're trying to determine right now. And the information about the greatest of all time will always be in flux. You can know that something has survived for 20 years, but what if it hasn't survived in 30 years? You can know that something has, you know, stood the test of time in one way or another. What if something only blows up 20 years later and then suddenly is massively influential? What if the changing population of the earth means that older stuff can't have as much impact? That's something that doesn't get brought up a lot in these GOAT conversations, that a lot of the most influential films in terms of like starting something, like let's say there's a film that comes out in the 20s, let's say Metropolis, just for the hell of it. Very, very big film, extremely high grossing film, you know, extremely influential, but it came out in the 20s. There were not nearly as many people on the earth who could have appreciated that film. Fewer people who went to the movies. Movies were not as big of a deal at the time, you know, as they are now, in terms of just being something that literally everyone will see. You know, it kind of inevitably, no matter how influential it was to all these filmmakers over time, is not a movie that is going to be seen by as many people or appreciated by as many people today. And while it has an enduring legacy that's lasted 100 years, you know, can we say whether it would have that if it came out today? You know, if it had to compete with everything else that's in the market right now. In the conversations that that they've been having about the greatest rapper of all time, something Rude Jude is always bringing up is that a lot of people will say, for instance, that Kendrick Lamar has been in the conversation. It's like, is he the greatest of all time? He's been around for about 10 years, put out a bunch of amazing classic albums that everybody loves. And some people have been saying that the reason is that the competition's not as strong. That back in the 90s, there were all these amazing rappers who were around. And now, you know, Kendrick's the only one doing real shit on the radio and stuff like that. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The truth is that there's way more competition than ever. Everybody's way more selective about what they choose. And there's just more options. There's different ways to be a rapper than there were back then. You know, back in the 90s, most rap kinda sounds alike. Personally for me, as a young guy looking back who did not grow up with 90s rap, when I go back and try to listen to it, it all sounds the same to me, because it's all the same style. It's all about, like, you know, your lyricism, your flow, your subject matter, and then you're doing it over the same kind of beats. I mean, there's distinctions, but, you know, they're harder to recognize for someone like me, where now you've got the option to go in whole different sounds and genres. You know, there's entirely new ideas of rap that exist now. And you're not just competing with other people who are on the same playing field as you. You're not just competing with like who's got the best lyrics. You're competing with who's got the best beat, who's doing something interesting and new, what genre are you in? You know, like you can't go and compare like Lil Ugly Mane to Kendrick Lamar and like expect those two to face off as who's the best rapper. It's like they're just not even in the same genre. They're both doing rap, sure, but like the entire feel of it is different. There's like nothing similar about it. And how would you determine? Because it's going to be two completely different tastes, you know? And I think that we're getting stuff that maybe doesn't reach as many people, but does reach them a lot more potently. I've talked about my boogie and pop dichotomy in previous vlogs, how, you know, they keep bringing up Tupac as the potential greatest of all time because he reached so many people. He had songs that appeal to everyone, every different type of person. However, I think now we have artists who appeal to a really small handful of people, but really strongly. And that's how we keep getting these micro genres and these things that like that people get really intensely into and spawn like all at once this culture around them. We've seen it with, for instance, something like Vaporwave and Future Funk, where like it just appeals to this subset of people so strongly that there becomes like a million future funk producers and everyone wants to do it. I mean, partly because it's easy and accessible to do, but like, you know, it reaches certain people on such a deep level that while it could never be mainstream, you know, it's for those people will have more of an impact on them than any major pop song that appeals to a huge amount of people will have. So like, you know, how do we say, like, what is the greatest of all time when the metrics are just constantly shifting? Like, you know, there's a movie that could come out now that might not seem like as big of a deal as one back then, but is seen by unbelievably more people and has a much deeper effect on those individuals, you know? Like, just the expansiveness of how much we have access to and how much, like, you can't compare things now to how things were before because it's just a whole different world. You know, you have to, like, just the way society functions is different. You could never have the Beatles today because nothing could ever, like, what could ever do that? Because there's too much music now, you know? Like, you can make something completely earth-shatteringly new, but it's never going to be mainstream because what would be mainstream was defined by what happened in the past. You know, like mainstream is all just building on this same narrative that's been going forever, whereas we've got all these completely different sub-narratives breaking off now, and it's just like, you know, there's bands now, new artists who are probably outselling the Beatles, reaching more people, having a bigger influence on those people, but, you know, maybe they won't stand the test of time. Has the Beatles stood the test of time? Or is it, like, propagated by the idea that they are the greatest? Which I think happens a lot. A lot of stuff that is, like, seen as a classic and is, like, regarded as... I mean, Beatles is a bad example because I do legitimately know, you know, lots of young people who love the Beatles and stuff. But I can think of examples of, like, you know, older films that everyone knows that they're influential and classic and we appreciate them, but like they don't really resonate with anybody anymore. You know, like we're propping them up because of what they were. Sort of like classical music, where like, yes, classical music's endured for hundreds of years and there is a small niche of people who really loves classical music and will propagate it forever. But the average person does not give a fuck about classical. So can we really say that any composer of classical music is the greatest of all time if no one cares about them now? Is the only thing that makes them special that their music has been around for 400 years? Because that could be true of all this modern pop music. We don't know. 400 years haven't passed, you know? Some stuff goes in and out of style. Some stuff might have a comeback, you know? Maybe in 10 years, nobody will remember Lady Gaga, but then 30 years from now, suddenly there'll be like a resurgence of it or something, or people will tell their grandkids about it because they grew up with it. You know, who knows? You never know what's going to make it into the future. But there's this idea that like, that the GOAT has to be something that's touched people for such a long period of time, even though a lot of the people who are still listening to these older artists are older and are we going to discount the opinions of young people? Like, let's say you're 15 and you think that, God, I almost said Linkin Park, but that dates me by 17 years. So what's a modern thing that a 15, let's say Lil Yachty is your favorite musician in the world, right? And you think he's the greatest of all time. Now, older people will say, well, that's only because you're 15, but if we're trying to define the greatest of all time, it should be everyone's opinion, right? Like, do only older people get to decide what's the greatest? Or is it a decision of, like, who is influencing the most people right now? Who is considered the greatest by the most people right now? Because at any given time, it's going to be someone different. You know, if we say, oh, well, that person's just the biggest right now, like Drake, let's say, you know, let's say we had a big poll, who's the greatest musician of all time, and Drake won. We'd be like, oh, Drake's popular now, but in 5 years, nobody's going to care about him. Yeah, but in 5 years, whoever you're thinking is the greatest is also not going to be at the top of that list. It's always going to be whoever's biggest right now, you know? Like, when is there ever going to be the moment where everyone agrees that the 40-year-old band is the greatest of all time? It's never going to come because they're surviving, but it's a smaller and smaller amount of people who care about their surviving, you know? Like, when everyone who listens to that artist dies off, are they still going to be remembered the way that they were? Or is it going to be these new kids who are going to keep talking about the shit they grew up with for the next 40 years, you know? The thing is that a lot of this music is young. Like, again, like with classical, the people who listened to classical at the time that it was being made are all dead, you know? And it's been phased further and further out of culture, and fewer people care about it. And that's going to happen to all the dad rock, you know, that was made in the 60s and 70s. Those people who listened to it at the time are still alive, but they won't always be. You know, people who listen to Tupac in the 90s will eventually be old, and stuff that I grew up on, which is not those bands, and those bands don't resonate with me because they're before my time and they never had an impact on me. The bands I liked, 20 years from now, I'm going to be talking about them, and I'm going to be like, oh, you young kids don't even know Coheed and Cambria and the Mars Volta. Oh, those are the most influential bands. They've survived with me for 20 years, you know, which is true. I've been listening to the same fucking shit for 15, 20 years, you know. There's plenty of bands I've been listening to my whole life, and I will most likely continue to listen to my whole life, but everyone's taste is going to get more and more individualized as time goes on, and it's going to be harder and harder to ever decide a GOAT, and we're all going to start pointing back. We're just going to look at, like, the Beatles and say, oh, well, that was like a flashpoint, you know, that's the GOAT because it created all this stuff, but it only had the opportunity to do that because it came out earlier, you know, but did it actually influence more people than something that comes out now and has the opportunity to reach billions, you know, in this extremely globalized world where, you know, an artist can have an impact everywhere? Are we going to start taking into account impact in other countries when we have these GOAT conversations? Like, I personally don't know how big Tupac is around the world, you know, but, like, there's rappers now who might have the opportunity to appeal to entire other countries that weren't accessible in the 90s, you know, and they'll proliferate a whole other musical culture within that country and be a huge influence on a world scale. You know, we are able to see more people, we're able to see more tastes, and, you know, I think the young people's opinions count towards the GOAT. You don't get to decide who's the GOAT just because you're older and have seen more, you know. It's just it's a complex thing where, again, it's always going to be decided in the moment. We're always going to be looking at it from right now. We're going to be saying, oh, this guy has survived for 20 years. But then in 20 years, we're going to be saying, oh, these guys have survived for 20 years. And that guy faded away. That guy who right now we thought was the GOAT because he survived for 20 years. And then 20 years from now, it turns out he didn't survive. He didn't survive 40 years, you know. But this guy who survived 10 years is still really big. And we all think he's, you know, it gets turtles all the way down. Point being that, you know, anybody who makes a top X of all time, there's always a receding cutoff, you know, like there's always the stuff that would have been the number one and would have been like common knowledge number one 10 years ago. It's not going to be the common knowledge number one 10 years after that, unless it's just upholding the narrative of itself as the greatest. You know, I really think there's certain stuff like the Beatles, like The Godfather, which we've been seeing because it's happened, because like the people talking about it are talking about it right now in the birth of the internet age where everyone's writing listicles about this shit, that we're seeing the same stuff be upheld. But as time goes on and we keep making these lists, we never stop making greatest of all times lists, we're going to see those shift. We're going to see new stuff start taking over the number one spots, and everything that grows older will fall further down. And even that stuff, I mean, there's obviously a bias towards a certain era, like the fact that The Godfather and the Beatles are from the same 10-year span. And like you see this with lots of greatest of all time stuff comes from the 80s. And you see a huge bias in video games, a much newer medium, for the late 90s. You look at any GOAT list, and the very top's going to be Final Fantasy VII from 1997, Ocarina of Time from 1998, Super Mario 64 from 1996 or 7, yeah, 6, I think, the very end of 96, something like that. You're going to see Deus Ex from 2000, and Quake, and like all this shit from the late 90s, early 2000s, because that's just the generation who's in control right now. The people who were teenagers when those games came out are the ones who are voting in all the polls, and they're reinforcing this narrative that these are the greatest games of all time, even though way fewer people are going to have played Ocarina of Time or Final Fantasy VII in 10 years than how many have now. And I promise you those two will not be upheld as the greatest games of all time 10 years from now. Or maybe 20, I don't know how long it'll take, but eventually we're going to reach a point where it might be one of the Grand Theft Auto games, or what do I think is another top contender? I mean, even with video games, because we're getting more and more of them, then this is also becoming an issue. Fucking Undertale won greatest game of all time in that poll on Game FAQs because of, people flooding in to vote for it. And like, that just means that like at that moment, Undertale was the greatest game of all time in public consciousness. Like maybe it won't be in 3 years, but it was then. So, I think it's always going to change, and you really can't have like one perennial greatest of all time. The only way to do that would be to go through all of human history and like chart what had been considered the greatest of all time the most times. And even that's going to keep changing as time goes on, So I think it's healthier for us to like maybe not be so worried about the idea that like the GOAT has to have survived a certain amount of time, or like has to have a certain amount of influence, because those things are so unpredictable. We're really saying the greatest up to right now. Anytime we make a GOAT list, we're saying what's the greatest of all time, cutting off at this moment, and it should be whatever it is in that moment. Not what it was 15 years ago, what it is now. What do people care about now? So maybe the question should never be, is there a greatest of all time? There can't be a greatest of all time. So, yeah. That's the GOAT paradox.